Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everybody, for welcoming me to what I'm so sorry has to be such an early lecture for you and what is a lovely 8 p.m. End to my day for me here in Canada. So today I will be talking to you about the role of coins in the study of Roman portraiture. And in some ways, of course, this is for anyone who's knows anything about Roman imperial portraiture, a fairly well-trodden subject, because since the very beginning of the study of Roman imperial portraiture, coins have always had a role. Coins, because of their labeled images, have always been really useful for people who want to be able to identify sculptures, to be able to see the labeled images and compare them to the sculptures. However, this is where a lot of portrait scholars end with their study of the coins, is with using the coins as an identification device without actually engaging with the coins as portraits in and of themselves. On the other hand, numismatic work, of course, also engages with the portraits of coins, but largely from the perspective of numismatic interests, right, to establish something like a chronology, as opposed to, again, engaging with like portrait methodology. While this strict divide has very much been breached in many ways over the past couple of decades, work particular by some important scholars such as Alexandrides have really been forging the way on this for quite a while. But there's still a lot that can be done for the full potential of the coin portraits to have their role in portrait studies, not just as an aside to the sculpture, but as portraits in and of themselves. So today, my goal is to demonstrate some of the value of this truly multimedia approach, giving equal consideration to the imperial coins, provincial coins, and sculpture when trying to understand the full scope of the portraiture of a given subject. These portraits were all part, as I argue, of the same portrait dissemination and reception system. And so understanding them all together is our best window into the complete functioning of the imperial portrait system. They're therefore our best way of understanding both the representation of the individual and all the messaging that went into that, but also the actual functioning of the system as a whole. So today I'm going to first run through the traditional understanding of how the portrait system worked, and then follow this with ways in which nuance can be added through my case study of looking at specifically the portraits of Sabina, who is the wife of Hadrian. So since antiquity, portraits of the emperor and his family have been one of the most recognizable forms of Roman art. In a world before photographs or videos, these images were, like us today, for most of the subjects of the Roman Empire, the only way they actually ever saw their rulers, regardless of course, how accurate or inaccurate that image may have actually been. Many of the biggest questions in portrait studies, therefore, regard the production of these images. While portraits in sculpture would have pretty much always been accompanied by a inscription that would identify the subject, and therefore identification was not a problem in antiquity. Unfortunately, most of our portraits that survive today have been removed from this context, therefore removing the primary means of identifying them. We can still identify many of these through comparison with other portraits that look similar. So these two examples on the slide are two portraits of the Empress Sabina, one found in Rome and one found in Turkey. And despite the differences in conservation, you can see even in the specific details, they're pretty close to exact copies of one another, especially if you look at the details on the right side so Sabina's right side of her head, you can see the locks and the individual strands very closely match each other in the arrangement of the hair. So across the empire, these two portraits are quite accurate copies of each other. As previously stated, our most common source for the initial labeled portrait that we have are the imperial coins. So in this example, we have this one labeled Sabina Augusta, Augusta being the main honorific for imperial women in this period. So the question, however, still remains of how and why did the inhabitants of the Roman Empire produce these very accurate copies? There's a well-established model for how the system worked that goes something like this. A new person comes to power or becomes a core member of the imperial household, and so an official model of their portrait is desired. So there's some sort of commission by a workshop, and there's quite a bit of scholarly disagreement of exactly how this part of the system worked, but in some way, a commission is made and an officially adopted portrait type gets created that is then adopted by the imperial court. In most cases, we're able to identify these different portrait types, meaning the different models based on hairstyles. So in the example on the slide, you can see the coin and the sculpture at the top and the coin and sculpture at the bottom are two different portrait types, both of Sabina. This is not because facial features were not just as relevant in portraiture in antiquity, or that they didn't, like us today, identify people by their faces, but it's rather because hairstyles, as was illustrated on the last slide a little bit, right, are more quantifiable. So you can count the locks and, there's a numerical quantification that you can do to them that is a little harder to accomplish with facial features. And so that's why we rely more on hairstyles. This is changing a little bit with new 3D scanning technologies. There's a bit more of a move back towards some really interesting facial feature analysis, but in most cases, we are stuck with the hairstyles as our most common way of identifying portraits. So according to this standard theory, when this new portrait type is adopted by the imperial administration, the model is then sent throughout the empire for copying in both coins and sculpture. We don't know exactly the form of these models. We don't have any source that tells us them, and we wouldn't probably know a model if we found one. There are different theories as to whether or not they were full-scale marble heads, if they were plaster or perhaps clay, so something cheaper, lighter, easier to transport, or they could, some sculpture scholars have shown that they could have actually been drawings as long as they have multiple angles. What we can say for sure is they were not just the coins themselves, because sculpture is able to be copied accurately on at least 3 angles, front and 2 sides. And so the coins in their profile are not going to be serving as our only model for the sculpture. The reasons for the creation of these different portrait types are also not always clear to us. There's times when we can link their introduction to special events, common events like an inauguration of a new reign or a 10-year anniversary of a reign are some of the more common ones. But there's other times where we don't know of a specific event. And it's very possible that many times there was not a special event associated with the introduction of a new portrait type, but instead they were just introduced because there was a desire for a change in appearance. In Italy, these models are then copied by the imperial mint and appeared on the imperial coins, as well as being copied in sculpture, both through individual commissions by groups like the government themselves, right? Governmental groups, the Senate, things like that, but also different associations, as well as individuals. So anyone who really wants to can sponsor and pay to commission a portrait sculpture. They're also then, of course, copied in the provinces by provincial artists in sculpture in the same way, as well as at provincial mints. There's seemingly little to no imperial oversight on the production of these images outside of probably the officially sanctioned, again, governmentally created sculptures, as well as the imperial mint. But otherwise, they're not really paying much attention probably to what individual provincial mints or sculptures are doing in terms of appearance. We actually only have 2 well-known references to provincial portraits in our sources, and both of them give the same critique, which is both the inaccuracy of these provincial portraits. The first one by Fronto is much more positive, where he talks about how he sees these portraits of Marcus Aurelius everywhere that he goes in the province, and while they don't really look much like him. It still brings a smile to his face to see these inaccurate portraits of Marcus Aurelius. The second one is a little more critical, which is the one on the slide by Arrian, in which Arrian on the Black Sea describes seeing this portrait of Hadrian, which he believes bears no resemblance to the original and is not worthy to be called Hadrian's, and so requests that a new portrait be sent to the province to replace this inadequate representation of the emperor. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions about the details of exactly how this system would have worked in practice, and there's a lot of implicit assumptions wrapped up in it. Remember that what we're working from is primarily just, besides these couple of passing literary references, is the portraits themselves. How closely were these models followed? What motivation was there for the image production of the various subjects? And was this kind of a consistent thing reign to reign, or did this vary? One described by Arrian, if this portrait were to be removed from its statue base, would we ever be able to know that that was supposed to be Hadrian if it truly, as Arrian suggests, bears no resemblance to Hadrian whatsoever? And finally, one of the big questions is, what is the relationship between the different media? What's the relationship between the imperial coin sculpture and provincial coins? So again, while coins have always had a role and an important role in answering these questions, I think there's still some ways they've been underutilized. And so I'll hopefully be able to illustrate a couple of really cool ways that the coins can add some color to this picture. Before moving on to the details of the Sphena portraits, I do also want to talk about the conventions of naming portrait types. So in sculpture scholarship, there's 5 main ways that portrait types are named. So when we have a model, we want to be able to refer to it in the scholarship. There are problems with all of them. There's no perfect method. Numbers 3 and 4, I think the potential issues are fairly self-explanatory, right? Naming them chronologically, as well as naming them according to a stylistic interpretation. These are conventions that, if you are correct, are great. But of course, if there's disagreement, or if maybe a new portrait type that dates earlier is discovered or something like that, now the numbering is off. So we get into these awkward situations where later scholars are talking about the portraits of someone and they say so-and-so's type 2, which is so-and-so's type 4, right? So it can get a little muddy in that respect. And of course, can also bias the reader if the interpretation is already in the name. The second one is the most common, which is naming based on the best representation in sculpture of the type. Prima Porta is probably the most famous, Augustus's main portrait type, named after that famous Prima Porta statue with the, from Livia's villa, the most classic, most identifiable Augustus of all time, which kind of artificially gives priority to an individual sculpture over the other ones, usually, yes, based on the quality of the copying, but also based on the quality of conservation, which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to actually be the most accurate to the original model. Additionally, Sabina presents us with one particularly, I think, telling example of some of the potential problems with this system, which is this portrait type, which is her most common sculpture type, is referred to in the scholarship since the early days as the Sallie de Busti 359 type, based on this bust in the Vatican. Now, there had been suspicions about this bust for a while. The conservation is quite good. The surface treatment is, quite severe. And it's also only a single piece of marble, which is uncommon for this kind of construction. But in 1999, Spinola actually conclusively proved that it is actually a modern forgery. And it was proven based on comparison with this actually ancient head in the Capitoline, which is an ancient head with a modern restored nose, which is very common for sculpture. And the Vatican head actually exactly copies the Capitoline head, including the modern nose, despite the nose not being a restoration. So we now have the situation where our scholarship on Sabina has this type, the most common sculpture type, named after a forgery. So another potential downside in this naming convention. The naming convention I favor, and the one that you'll see me use for the Sabina portraits, is this fifth one, which is themed based on appearance. So trying to have just kind of the most neutral description of the appearance of the type as possible. So the Q, when they're wearing, what we in North America would call more traditionally like a ponytail, etc. So these kinds of just basic descriptions of the hairstyle, which is much easier for women than men, who often there's not as many, specific features to talk about. But so that's the naming convention that I favor, as you'll see on the next slide. But what I wanted to talk about for the sake of this talk is this first one, which is naming based on frequency in sculpture. So this is really common to call something the main type. And this Salé de Busti type is also often called the main type for Sabina because it's the most common type in sculpture. This is also, Haupttypus is a really common way to refer to as well, which is just the German for main type, because German is such a common foundational language in portrait scholarship. The problems with this is that it gives, first of all, this sense that there was an intentional main type that was produced that is somehow more important or more favored by the administration than the others, but also gives primacy to sculpture, because as we're going to see, the main type in sculpture might not be the main type in other media, and these distinctions in what the main type is in different media are actually quite illustrative of the distinctions in the motivations and production of the different media. And so that's what we will be getting into in the rest of this talk. So in terms of sculpture, like most imperial figures, these types were primarily identified based on the coins. And so what you see in the dating at the top of this slide is actually the dating based on the coins. Unlike the imperial coins, however, the sculpture is probably not restricted to the dates that it was on the coins. There probably are still individual commissions being done after it disappears from the coin. So these are more of the start date for these types as opposed to the end dates as well. As always with sculpture as well, there is, of course, no universal agreement of exactly how many specimens we have, and there's always disagreement of which ones should be included and which ones should not. These numbers are based on my own criteria. I've identified 39 total sculptures as Sabina. These include only portraits that do correspond with the imperial portrait types on the coins. But this is not to say that that is accurate to all of the range of portraits that were created of Sabina, but rather to acknowledge the methodological challenge of positively identifying a truly uncanonical portrait, right? So a portrait like the one Arian described that has no resemblance to the official type. It's not to say that these aren't out there. It's to say that I can't confidently enough identify them in order to include them in the catalog. Primarily, most of these do come from Italy or have no known provenance. There are a couple that come from the provinces, but the vast majority are Italian or provenance unknown. Yes. So when we look at the distribution of the types, the main thing to note for this as we move on to look at the coins is the prominence of the basket, which is this one this is the Salé de Busti type, the main type that was referred to in the previous slide, which I call the basket, just based on the visual appearance of the hairstyle. This represents 61% of her portraits in sculpture. 10% of those are actually the knot, which is actually the only type that does not appear on the coinage that I have included in the sculpture. And when we get to the interpretation section, I'll get into exactly why I think we can confidently identify these as Sabina despite them not appearing on the coinage, but they're very closely related. It's just that front element of the hair that's changed between them. So whether you consider this a subtype of the basket or its own type, your mileage may vary. So either way, the basket represents at least half of all of our known sculptures of Sabina, and the nest is by very clearly the second place at 23%, with the others fairly small numbers. Moving on to look at the imperial coins. we have, as you can see, a completely different picture when it comes to typological distribution in numbers. So first of all, we have 5 total types. The knot does not appear, as was mentioned, and we have a different type that was not on the sculpture, which is the chignon, which you can see as that second one there. It does not appear on the gold. That's why it is a different type of coin than the others. But you can see the chronology. So a couple of noteworthy things about the coinage is, first of all, that it doesn't start until 10 years into Hadrian's reign. So Hadrian comes to power a decade earlier, but it's not until the start of his second decade that Sabina first appears. Probably at the end of 127 to / very early 128 is when she first appears with the nest. So these types have all been dated and named by me. Some of these names did exist in earlier scholarship, some of them did not. The dating as well, some of this correlates with earlier scholarship, some of this is fairly different. And the dating is based on 2 dye studies I conducted of the Ori, one of the Ori and one of the Dupont and As, and I can talk in more detail about exactly how that method works in the question period if anyone's curious. But what's important to note here is that the numbers for the Ori and the Dupont and As are dye numbers, not coin count numbers, which is a bit more accurate. So it's the individual stamps we have of each portrait, as opposed to individual coin specimens. And so you can see from the table that both denominations make up 55% Q types, so over half Q. And I will say I did do just basic numerical calculations for the other denominations, and there's no major discrepancies from these among the other denominations. So these are fairly representative. So yes, the Q is, as you can see, very high numbers. The basket compared to the sculpture, in contrast, is super low. And the chignon, you can see, only really appears on a single denomination for a short period of time. So overall, there's really not much of a correlation between the 2 media in terms of the actual numerical breakdown, the proportion of the different portrait types. So moving on to our final medium, which are the provincial coins. Roman provincial coins functioned very differently in the 2 halves of the Roman Empire. By the time of Hadrian, we're just going to simplify it by just talking at this point, by the time of Hadrian's reign, we're in a situation where we do not have any provincial coins being struck in the western half of the empire. So Rome, the imperial mint, is producing all of the coinage for the western half of the empire, whereas the east has this long tradition of minting its own coinage at these individual local city mints dating back most to the Hellenistic period, some even earlier than that. And so Rome, in their classic kind of work smarter, not harder approach to provincial administration, allows these mints to continue striking their own small change. There's also some amount of silver production that is also permitted at some of the larger provincial mints. Whereas gold, of course, is always controlled by Rome. They're not quite okay with that happening in the provinces. So it's very clear from the diversity of the appearance of the provincial coins that there is no significant imperial oversight over their appearances, which makes sense. That would be a huge undertaking for seemingly no benefit. But it is interesting that despite this, by the time of Hadrian, almost all mints have adopted the imperial image as the obverse type. So while the reverses maintain a very local character, so this coin from Sparta has a Dioscuri on it, a very traditional Spartan image, the obverse has now adopted the portrait of Hadrian. So we're adopting that imperial imagery. We do still have some places that do not adopt the imperial portrait, which is evidence that it was not a requirement that the mints do so. But again, seemingly they chose to do so for whatever reason. So as our most plentiful body of imperial portraits from outside of Italy, these coins are by far our best evidence for the portrait dissemination outside of Italy and to the provinces. They're really beneficial for their large numbers and wide geographical distribution, with hundreds of active mints throughout the region. You can see this on the map of the slide, which is from the Antonine period. Additionally, we don't have the same problem, of course, of identification because like the imperial coins, they do generally, in almost all cases, have the name of the subject written on the obverse. These coins, therefore, can give us insights into some things we can't get at otherwise. What are the provinces actually doing with the imperial image? And especially this question of those uncanonical portraits, those ones described in Aryan. We now have this large body of provincial portraits with labels on them. So we can get at that question a little bit. When we bring the evidence from the provincial coins, once again, we see the situation shift considerably in terms of the numbers. These numbers are based on number of coin types in the Roman provincial coinage online database, as opposed to individual coin counts. Once again, the map shows the distribution of the different portrait types across the provinces. And so you can see the legend on the side there, so you can follow the different portrait types, and you can see how this matches the table on the slide. So once again, huge difference from the other media we've seen so far. So 75% of the provincial coins represent the nest, which is once more a pretty big difference than what we saw on the imperial coins or the sculptures. We also see the basket is entirely absent, despite, again, being this most common type in sculpture. And we also see our first appearance of identifiable uncanonical images, and they make up about 8% of the total coin portraits from the provinces of Sabina. So what can we make of these major distinctions? So this lack of correlation in the typological distribution shows just how different these three media were, which suggests probably differences in the motivations behind their production. So starting with the imperial coinage, the situation is, I think, the most comprehensible, the most straightforward, because in general, these proportions do seem to be relative to the actual length of time in which the portrait type was current on the imperial coins. From the dye studies, it does not seem that there's any significant overlap or return to old portrait types across the Sabina imperial coins. And so this is just a sort of sequential chronology, and they're roughly in proportion to how long they appeared. Therefore, we have the Q in the red box there, which is our longest serving type, and therefore also our most plentiful types, dating for being in use for about 6 of the 10 years of Sabina's coin production. So based on this, we can conclude that any significant deviations from this in the other media reflect something different going on, right? Probably either
a bit great. Why?
Can you help me?
Yep.
Probably either a difference in the
there?
probably either a difference in the amount of stuff that's being made in a short period of time, so like a chronological concentration of a type, or in the length of time a type was used. So it's used maybe much longer than it was in use at Rome. So let's move on to look at the sculpture then and explain these distinctions. So again, sculptures being individual commissions, their quantities therefore are quite sporadic over time, and we can expect maybe some clustering based on certain conditions that are motivating sculpture production. So the main question, of course, here is why was there so much made of the basket, which, if we are to believe the coin dating, was only current for about a year, probably, on the imperial coins. So the types dating has been a source of debate, largely because its presence on coins had actually not even been properly identified as a standalone type until a couple of years ago when Richard Abdi published that. It had previously been lumped in with the nest and not actually even properly acknowledged on the imperial coins. Many previous sculpture scholars date it much earlier, often in relation to Sabina's acquisition of the title of Augusta, thought to have happened in 128. Because it's so common, And because it was conflated with the nest, the idea is it must have been in use for a really long time. However, the die sequence seems to argue against that. So to give you just a quick sort of gist of how it worked, ancient coins, right, are made by striking a blank piece of metal between two dies. These dies are hand carved, so even when they have the same design, the specific details of the types will still be identifiably different on different dies. And so if you compare these, and if you really, you have to have a certain personality for this, but if you really enjoy this kind of heavily detailed work, if you look at a lot of them together, you can create this linked sequence of these where you can see, for example, on this slide, you can see the same die is used for the reverse of these coins. So that seated Concordia is the exact same die. You can look at all the little details of the striking in terms of how the letters line up with the design. You can see that it all correlates. Whereas the obverse, I picked up a more obvious one for the sake of demonstration. They're facing different directions. So obviously what we have here is this situation where we have the same die on one face, but different ones on the other. So if you can imagine, we can eventually find examples of other ones that maybe share the first obverse, but not the same reverse. And then you can get this chain of linked ones, which will create a relative chronology between the coins. And so if you do enough of this, you can get something like this. This is the Aureus chart. I'm not using the Duplantius one because it's not relevant to this particular question, because this is where this type appears in higher numbers. But here we can see where this hairstyle appears in the die chart based on die links. In particular, we have a very clear linking where we have the appearance of a posthumous example of the type, where the inscription says Diva Aug Sabina, so we know she's deceased at this point, and it is die linked with ones that are not yet indicating that she is deceased yet. So we, from this, can be fairly confident that this dates to the end of Sabina's life or close to it, because it's a small amount of coins near the end there, die linked with the end of this sequence. There's a couple other hints, but hopefully the chart illustrates it well. So it's pretty clear that this can't be that Augusta type that a lot of the sculpture people wanted it to be. Instead, it is pretty far down to the end. So then, of course, the question has to be, well, why were there so many portraits made in such a short amount of time? And to this, I argue that this represents the outsized impact of imperial jubilees on the production of portraits, particularly in Rome itself. So our second most common one is the nest, which also appears on an imperial jubilee. So you can see that these two types appear 10 years apart from each other. And one of the big celebrations emperors would have is their 10-year anniversary, the Decanalia, and the 20-year anniversary, should they last so long, the Vicanalia. And so we see this fairly clear increase in portrait production at these two key points. Probably the basket gets even more attention because also within probably the same year, Sabina dies and Hadrian also dies. So there's probably also a significant amount of sculpture production happening surrounding this event. We do then have some posthumous ones with the veiled representations, but my argument is that it is this confluence of these major statue production events at the Capitol, because again, most of our extant sculpture is Italian, is probably the motivating factor here. So we can see this huge difference between the coins and the sculpture, but also the fact that this chronology and this correlation really could not have been established without the knowledge from the imperial coins. So moving forward then to talk about our next, I think I went too far, there we go. Talk about our next group, which are the provincial coins. So in the provinces, the motivations for coin production are, of course, complex because we're dealing with hundreds of different mints in individual cities, all making their own coins for all kinds of different reasons in terms of, financial requirements of the community. Of course, during Hadrian's reign, we have imperial visits, putting a large financial burden on the places that they visit, and therefore spurring seemingly coin production in some cases. But therefore, we can't always get at like the details of specific coin issues and why they're made, right? There's probably a financial reason behind them. We shouldn't expect, of course, a totally even distribution of coins across time, but we also shouldn't expect, because there's so many different mints at so many different times, we also should not be probably expecting a situation like sculpture where we have these like major clusters chronologically. Once again, in contrast to other media, we have this huge amount of the nest. You might think that this is a chronological clustering situation in which we have a lot of the nest because it comes first, and they made a lot of provincial coins for Sabina in the first 2 years of her appearing on the imperial coins. However, we're really fortunate that some of the provincial coins actually do write the date of manufacture on them. And among the coins with recorded dates, they span the entire length of Sabina's coin production with the nest. So in fact, our latest dated coin of all of Sabina's coins is still using the nest. And this is a wide range of really high quality productions at major imperial connected mints like Alexandria, as well as small local civic mints. They're all still using this portrait type throughout the entire 10 years of her reign. Therefore, there's something else going on here. And I would argue that this is a situation where we have a less thorough distribution of new portrait types to the provinces than what is assumed when we read our standard interpretation of how the system works, this idea that new portrait types, when invented, are then sent to provincial centers for copying. The evidence I've seen, not just from the Sabina coins, but also I've been doing a study of provincial coin portraits of imperial women from the 1st and 2nd century in general, and they all follow the same pattern of having this one main type, regardless of how many types they have at Rome, which suggests to me that instead what's happening is that Rome is simply not intentionally thoroughly distributing every new portrait type as it comes, which again, if we think about Roman approaches to imperial administration, makes perfect sense, right? The different meanings behind these different imperial portrait types are very relevant to the people at the mint designing them, but are probably not the most relevant to like a person in Cilicia, or at least from the perspective of the Roman imperial administration, right? These messages are not that important of a change in order to motivate the new circulation of a new portrait type. So I don't mean to suggest that provincial mints therefore did not use coins as models, because I know this is the standard numismatic interpretation, that the provincial mints are simply using the imperial coins in circulation. Certainly this does happen sometimes, right? We have cases where a whole coin design from the imperial mint is copied at a provincial mint. So certainly this does happen. But I would argue that most, this is not the main source for the models that the provincial mints are using, at least the main centers, which are then being copied by their surrounding smaller cities. Instead, I think that I argue, and I can get into more of the evidence for this in the question period, but that the provincial coin portraits are actually part of this system. So they are reflective of the models that are being sent to the rest of the system as well, as opposed to minters like looking in their change for what the current appearance of the Empress is. And it's also in this context that we can better understand the uncanonical representation. So we have this 8% uncanonical group here. And these are very exciting because, again, they're the only uncanonical ones of Sabina that we can be like confident these are supposed to be Sabina. And so we can get a sense of what do these look like? What are they doing when they're not using imperial models? And what they're doing is using the next best thing, basically. So in pretty much all cases, I've put a little box around this Ephesus one, because the Ephesus one is the outlier, because again, we have hundreds of mints making their own decisions. And so there are always going to be outliers to any rule you try to establish for the provincial mints. But overall, overwhelmingly, not just for Sabina, but across all the different empresses that I've investigated so far, we see that when they do not use an imperial model, they use the most recent empress model that they have. Now, interestingly, the women from Trajan's reign were really not well disseminated to the provinces at all. There's really low accuracy in their portrait type copying. So we actually don't have that many of Trajanic women being copied in the Sabina uncanonicals. We have this Byzantium coin, which is clearly a Platina model being used. But the rest of them, almost all the rest of them, actually use Flavian models because that is probably the next most recent model that a lot of these mints had for an imperial woman. So this shows seemingly that these provincial mints were really invested in following the imperial typology as much as they could, that they when they didn't have a model, but they still wanted to honor a person on the coinage, they used the next best thing they had, which was another imperial woman, which seemingly they didn't have a problem with, was not considered like insulting to either the woman appearing on the coins or the woman whose coin is supposed to be. This is especially humorous for Domitia, who her portrait continues to be reused for every subsequent woman for the next several administrations, despite the fact that she is actually alive this whole time. She lives well into Hadrian's reign and appears as Platina, as Matidia, Marciana, Sabina. So it's quite a humorous episode for her. But yeah, we get this is the situation that we get. And so the question is, why don't they have models? My argument here is that these almost exclusively, again, excluding the Ephesus example, which does appear to be a genuinely unique invention and commemorative probably of the imperial visit, the rest of them appear to probably be prior to Sabina's official introduction to the imperial coinage in 127. So they predate the existence of a proper model. These people still want to honor the empress. They know she's the empress through other means, and so they rely on the next best thing. And this really correlates very well with the evidence for the other imperial women based on the accuracy of the copying based on model availability. So one final category I have left out until here, because I think this is a perfect example of how the media can really merge together in really interesting ways, is the knot, right? This type that I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, this very strange kind of hybrid. It doesn't appear on any of the imperial coins, but it is clearly identifiable as Sabina. So the knot, here is its appearance. It exists in 4 extant specimens. There are 2 primary reasons that I do believe we can associate this with Sabina, despite it not appearing on the imperial coins. First is the archaeological context in which they were found. 3 of the 4 extant portraits were certainly found at the Villa Adriana, so Hadrian's villa in Tivoli outside of Rome, which of course is Sabina's husband. So presumably the person represented in these is someone very close to Hadrian who's getting multiple portrait copies. And these are the majority of the portraits of Sabina from the villa. There aren't many otherwise. And second is that the back half of the hairstyle does directly correlate with the basket type. So I've put the basket type at the top of the slide here. You can compare with the Turin head. So the whole back half of the hair is the same. The only difference is this knot at the front. And the knot is also very interestingly, and this is how, again, all 3 media can really come together, because the knot itself is also not without precedent in Sabina's portraits, but it doesn't appear this way on the imperial coins. It appears on the Alexandrian coins. So Sabina and Hadrian, on their grand tour of the empire, visit Egypt in 130 and stay for quite a while. And it's during this tour for 2 years that there's this change in Sabina's portrait appearance. And this includes the addition of this knot at the top of her hairstyle. There's been a lot of different interpretations of what this is. Not everyone has identified it as a knot previously, but I think especially in these two die examples on the slide, I think the fact it's the double square knot is fairly visible. This has traditionally been interpreted as associated with Isis, the Egyptian goddess, which very much correlates with the fact that it is this trip to Egypt. And I have a very kind of conspiratorial theory about this whole Egyptian cult association with this portrait type that I'm happy to elaborate on a bit at the end if there's time. But what's important here is that we have this connection that is uniquely found on provincial coins from Egypt, as well as private imperial sculpture at the villa. Now, the Villa Adriana is well known for its Egyptianizing art. This is something that Hadrian was very into at the time. We got, there's all those famous Antinous as Osiris portraits from the villa. There's also like lots of just like Nile crocodiles and all kinds of things like that. And so it makes sense that we have these Egyptianizing portraits of Sabina appearing at the villa at the same time. But again, this is the kind of interpretation that really can only come together through all three media, right? The imperial coins, the sculpture, and the provincial coins.